There's a myth we've been sold that gardening is hard, that it means expensive bags of soil, chemical sprays, and back-breaking work, all for 3 small tomatoes. But it wasn't always like this. Your grandma's garden. It was probably a jungle. It was messy by our standards, a tangle of plants you couldn't always name. But it produced everything. The pantry was always full. What did she know that we've forgotten? It's simple. She wasn't working. She was conducting an orchestra. She was using a set of forgotten, almost magical rules to get more food for less work. Today, we're digging up the most powerful of those secrets, starting with the plants that formed the very foundation of her garden, the ones that asked for almost nothing at all. There's a good chance that if you visit an old farmhouse, you'll find it. Tucked away in some forgotten corner, right by the rusty side of the shed, is a patch of deep red stalks that hasn't been tended in 20 years, and it is absolutely thriving. The Ignore Me rhubarb patch. This was Grandma's ultimate plant-it-and-forget-it food. Rhubarb is tough. It's a perennial, which means you put it in the ground just one time, not once a year. Once. That single, one-time afternoon of work could provide tart stalks for pies, jams, and sauces for the next 30 or 40 years. It was the very definition of efficiency. The plant thrives on total neglect. It can withstand brutal winters under feet of snow, shrugs off rocky soil, and comes back stronger every single spring. All it asked was for you to come by and pull some stalks. Back in the day, it was a staple, the classic sweet tart partner to strawberries. But today, the rhubarb patch has vanished. We've become impatient. Gardeners want results now. They don't have the patience to let a plant establish for a year or two, even if it means a lifetime of food. We'd rather buy our pies from a store, never knowing the taste of something that asked for nothing and gave everything. That old patch, though, is probably still there, hanging on by the fence line. It was the ultimate plant-it-and-forget-it food. But what about the plant-it-and-wait food? The one that asked for patience, and in return, gave a lifetime of reward? If the rhubarb patch was a lesson in neglect, the asparagus bed was the ultimate test of patience. It was an act of faith, a promise made to the future. And it was a promise that always paid off. The 20-year bed asparagus isn't like most vegetables. You can't just plant it in May and expect to harvest it in July. When Grandma's generation planted an asparagus bed, they were making a serious commitment. For the first 2, sometimes 3, full years, you couldn't touch it. You had to let the plants establish their roots, tending and weeding them with zero reward. It was an exercise in pure anticipation. This is precisely why you rarely see them today. We are wired for quick results, for the instant gratification of a radish or a lettuce leaf. But Grandma knew the secret. She wasn't just planting a crop, she was building a food factory. Because after that 3rd year, the magic began. That patch would send up dozens of tender, perfect spears every single spring with almost zero effort. No tilling, no replanting. It just appeared. A well-tended asparagus bed wasn't just food, it was a legacy. Some patches were known to produce for 50 years, feeding the next generation. It was the very definition of less work for the long haul. It was a permanent, reliable fixture of the garden. But this idea of letting things be went even further. What if you didn't even have to plant them at all? Did you ever wonder why Grandma never seemed to plant herbs like dill or parsley? You never saw her buying the seeds or marking the rows, and yet, every summer, she had an endless, fragrant supply. The weed that became a staple. Her secret was a form of managed neglect that modern gardening has almost completely forgotten. When her dill or cilantro was finished for the season, she didn't immediately pull the plants to tidy up the bed. She would let a few of the best ones go to seed, allowing their flower heads to dry out right on the stalk. The wind and the birds did the rest. Nature itself handled the replanting. The following spring, new seedlings would pop up wherever the seeds had landed, often in the most perfect places. Dill would sprout between the tomatoes. Parsley would fill a gap by the walkway. These weren't weeds, they were volunteers. And they were almost always hardier than anything bought from a store because they had chosen the exact spot where they wanted to grow. This wasn't laziness, it was genius. It guaranteed a free, permanent, and self-sustaining patch of herbs, year after year, for zero work. Today, we fight to keep everything in neat, tidy rows, buying new packets of seeds every spring, never realizing that Grandma won the game by simply letting go. This same philosophy of using what was already there applied to her structures too. She saw the entire yard as one giant, interconnected garden. Why spend a hot afternoon building a trellis, lashing poles together with twine, when the entire backyard was already full of perfectly good structures? Grandma's generation saw opportunity where we just see a fence. The living fence of pole beans. That simple wire fence, the one meant to mark the property line or keep the dog in, was also a food factory. It was a pre-made 100-foot-long trellis, and it was a terrible waste to leave it empty. So, they planted pole beans and cucumbers and even vining squash right at its base. The plants did the rest, climbing toward the sun, covering the wire in a wall of green. The work saved was immense. There was no need to buy lumber, no post holes to dig, no flimsy tomato cages to assemble. But it was also about space. By growing vertically, they saved all that precious garden soil for root crops like carrots and potatoes. And the best part was the harvest. The beans and cucumbers hung down at eye level, easy to spot and pick. There was no back-breaking bending, no stooping, no hunting for produce hidden under sprawling leaves. That chain-link fence, the side of the shed, even the porch railing. Every structure was multitasked. It was pure, simple efficiency, using one thing for two jobs. They found a harvest in the most expected places. But sometimes, the most surprising bounty, the one that cost zero work and zero planning, came from a spot that wasn't supposed to be a garden at all. One of the strangest, most wonderful sights in an old-school garden was finding a massive, thriving squash plant, growing 20 feet away from the actual garden beds. It was a bonus, a gift from the waste pile, the volunteer squash from the compost pile. This was the zero-work garden in its purest form. Today, we treat our compost bins like scientific equipment, worried about greens and browns and proper temperatures. Grandma just had a pile in the corner. And she knew that this pile wasn't just fertilizer, it was an incubator. Into that heap went all the kitchen scraps, the seeds from a summer cantaloupe, the stringy insides of a pumpkin, the overripe tomatoes that didn't make the cut. The pile would heat up, the scraps would rot, and deep inside, those seeds would wait. Then, a few would sprout. A strong, determined vine would fight its way to the surface, finding a rich, nutrient-dense paradise. When Grandma saw a healthy plant like that emerging from the compost, she didn't treat it like a weed. She just let it go. These volunteers were often the hardiest, most productive plants in the yard, having already proven their will to live. It was the ultimate expression of working with nature. It was a free, unexpected harvest, born from the very scraps that modern life just throws away. That pile in the corner was more than just an incubator. It was the entire engine of the garden. It was the power plant. Long before gardeners spent hundreds of dollars on fancy, tumbling compost bins, there was the pile. It was often just a pit, tucked away out of sight, and it was the silent, humble engine of the entire garden. The garbage hole fertilizer. This was the definition of effortless efficiency. Today, we've turned composting into a chore, a science experiment of greens and browns, moisture levels and ratios. Grandma's generation just had a heap. Into this pit went everything: coffee grounds, eggshells, potato peels, onion skins, carrot tops, and leaves. There was no work involved. No turning with a pitchfork every weekend, no checking temperatures, no complicated enclosures. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't neat, but it didn't have to be. It was a slow, patient, and completely passive collaboration with the earth. All it required was time. Over the months, that garbage would settle, darken, and be broken down by worms and microbes who did all the heavy lifting for free. Every spring, that pile provided shovelfuls of the richest, darkest black gold imaginable, a perfect, free fertilizer to feed the New Year's vegetables. It was the ultimate closed-loop system. Waste from the kitchen became food for the soil, which in turn grew more food for the kitchen. That pile was the garden's passive power plant, turning waste into pure energy. But there was another, living power plant in the yard, a plant that actively mined the earth for treasure and did the fertilizing for you. There was one plant in the old gardens that was treated with a kind of mystical respect. It wasn't a food. It wasn't a showy flower. It was a leafy, unassuming thing called comfrey, and it was the ultimate workhorse. The cure-all comfrey patch. This was the original garden multi-tool. Grandma knew its secret. Comfrey was a living fertilizer factory. Its roots ran incredibly deep, 10, sometimes 20 feet into the subsoil, acting like a biological drill. They pulled up valuable minerals, potassium, phosphorus, and calcium that other plants with shallow roots could never reach. This made it a nutrient accumulator. The work-saving part was its chop-and-drop nature. The large, nutrient-dense leaves were simply cut down and left to rot right on the soil, creating a perfect, self-renewing mulch that fed the surrounding plants. Or they'd be tossed in a bucket of water to create a famously potent, famously stinky liquid fertilizer that made tomatoes go wild. It was a one-plant powerhouse, a mineral miner, a mulch maker, and a fertilizer brewer, all in one. It even had a folk reputation as knitbone for its healing properties. One plant doing 4 jobs. So the garden was fed for free, creating a rich, fertile paradise. But all that good soil was an open invitation for weeds. And all that good food was a dinner bell for pests. To stop the garden from being overrun, Grandma had to build a fortress, and she built it out of flowers. Walk past any old-timer's garden, and you'd see them. Bright, fiery borders of orange and yellow tucked right against the tomatoes and beans. Those marigolds weren't just for decoration. They were on duty. The living fence of marigolds. This was biological pest control, long before our shelves were lined with chemical sprays and neon-colored powders. Grandma's generation knew that the garden could and should defend itself. The marigold was a humble, hard-working soldier in this fight. Its pungent, peppery scent, which we might find pleasant, was a blazing keep-out sign for a whole host of enemies. That sharp smell repelled the dreaded tomato hornworm and kept cabbage moths from laying their eggs on the broccoli. But the marigold's real magic, its most important work, was happening completely unseen, underground. The roots of the marigold released a compound into the soil that was toxic to root knot nematodes, those microscopic worms that can devastate a crop by attacking its roots. It was a living fence, a protective biological barrier that guarded the valuable plants inside the perimeter. The work was simple. Plant a border of them in the spring, and the garden was protected all season long. No mixing, no spraying, no chemicals to buy. It was just another plant doing a job. Today, we've forgotten this simple wisdom, reaching for a plastic bottle instead of a seed packet. The marigolds protected the plants above ground and below. But what about protecting the soil itself and saving her back from the endless, agonizing work of weeding the paths? For that, she turned to a different kind of recycled material, straight from the kitchen floor. Today, weeding is a war. We wage it on our knees with trowels or with chemical sprays that promise total destruction, turning the soil into a sterile battlefield. But Grandma won this war before it even started. And she did it using last week's news. The kitchen floor weed block. This was the simple, brilliant practice of sheet mulching. Instead of spending hours pulling weeds, she prevented them. That stack of old newspapers in the kitchen, or the cardboard box from a delivery, was seen as a resource. She would lay these materials down in thick layers, 8 or 10 sheets deep, all along the garden paths and in the tight spaces between the vegetable rows. Then she'd cover them with a thin layer of straw or wood chips to hold them down. The effect was immediate. This dense, light-proof barrier smothered any existing weeds and stopped new ones from ever seeing the Sunday. It was a set-it-and-forget-it solution. This method wasn't just less work, it was almost no work. It was completely free, recycling a material that was otherwise just trash. And it had a bonus. As the newspaper and cardboard slowly broke down over the season, they fed the earthworms, building richer, healthier soil and retaining moisture. Today, we spend good money on plastic landscape fabric that chokes the soil, forgetting that the perfect organic solution is still sitting in our recycling bins. The fortress was built. The garden was fed, it was weed-free, and it was protected. But what happens during a 3-week summer drought? All that work, all that rich soil just bakes and dies in the Sunday unless You used the ancient secret for watering the garden from below. How did Grandma's tomatoes stay lush during a 3-week drought, long before the days of sprinkler systems and soaker hoses? She didn't drag a heavy hose around the yard. She borrowed an ancient secret, and she watered the garden from below. The buried clay pot trick. This was pure, simple genius, often using unglazed terracotta pots, sometimes just called ollas. The method was laughably simple. You took a pot, plugged the bottom hole, and buried it in the garden bed, right next to the tomatoes or squash. Only the small opening was left visible above the soil. You'd fill that pot with water every few days, and the pot did all the work. Because the clay was unglazed, it was porous. The water didn't rush out, it seeped. Slowly, perfectly, it would move through the microscopic holes in the clay, drawn directly into the dry soil. It only released water when the soil needed it, and it delivered it right at the root zone where it mattered most. This was the original set it and forget it irrigation. No water was lost to the hot Sunday. No leaves got wet, which prevented disease. And most importantly, it saved Grandma the back-breaking work of standing there with a hose. It encouraged roots to grow deep and strong, searching for that reliable source. It was a perfect ancient irrigation system that cost almost nothing and lasted for years. This wisdom, this way of getting something for free. It was the same thinking she applied to next year's plants, ensuring she'd never have to buy seeds again. Grandma never bought those colorful seed packets from the hardware store. She knew you didn't need to buy what the garden gave you for free. She made her own seeds using a process that looked, well, a little gooey. The gooey seed saving secret. This was the height of self-sufficiency. Today, we think saving seeds is complicated, something for experts. For her, it was just obvious. When she found the perfect tomato, the sweetest, meatiest, most disease-resistant one, she'd scoop the seeds out, plop them into a small jar with a bit of water, and just let them sit on the windowsill for a few days. The mixture would ferment, and a layer of scum would form on top. It looked awful. A layer of gray, fuzzy mold would bubble up, a smell that would make you want to throw the whole jar out. But Grandma knew this was the magic. That rotting goo was a living, breathing shield, eating away the diseases that would kill the next generation of plants. It was alchemy in a jar. After 3 or 4 days, she'd rinse the gunk off in a sieve, spread the clean seeds on a plate to dry, and put them in an envelope for next spring. That was it. The result? Hundreds of free plants for next year. And these weren't just any plants. They were the offspring of her best plant, perfectly adapted to her specific soil and her specific climate. This was a kind of preservation, ensuring the next harvest. But what about preserving the current harvest? She had a simple, no-energy trick for that too, and it turned the pantry into a work of art. After the main harvest, the real work of preservation began. But the smartest, most efficient methods involved no hot kitchens, no sterilizing jars, and zero electricity. They were passive, patient, and often beautiful. The onion braid on the rafter today, we think preservation means a long, hot day of canning. That was for tomatoes. For onions and garlic, the method was far simpler. They were braided. After being pulled from the soil and left to cure in the sun, their papery tops were skillfully woven together, creating long, heavy ropes of food. These braids weren't just decorative, though they were stunning, hanging in a pantry like rustic chandeliers. This was a profoundly practical, ingenious storage system. By hanging them from the rafters of a cool shed or a dark basement, every single bulb was surrounded by circulating air. This was the secret. It prevented the moisture, mold, and rot that would quickly spoil a harvest just tossed in a bin. It was a visual, accessible pantry. You didn't have to dig through a crate. You just snipped an onion off the braid when you needed one. It was a point of pride, a visible reminder of the garden's bounty, lasting deep into the winter. Today, we just grab a plastic mesh bag from the supermarket, never knowing the simple art of making food last. This entire system, the self-feeding, self-watering, self-defending garden, was the wisdom. But the final act of genius was knowing what to do with the massive harvest it produced. How do you turn a summer vegetable into a food that can feed your family in the dead of winter? You didn't need a canner, a freezer, or a single glass jar. You just needed a sunny spot and a little patience. The cure it on the roof method. This was the forgotten secret to making winter squash last. That heavy butternut, that warty Hubbard, or that deep green acorn squash was a storage marvel, but only if you cured it properly. Today, we buy them pre-cured from a supermarket, never seeing the simple, vital step that makes their long life possible. After the harvest, Grandma didn't just haul them to the cellar. She'd line them up, side by side, on a sunny porch, a dry patch of lawn, or even the low, warm roof of a shed, and just let them sit. For a week, maybe two, those squash would sunbathe. This wasn't just for drying. The warm sun was performing a kind of alchemy. It was hardening the skin, thickening it into a woody, impenetrable armor. It was also healing any small nicks or stem scars from the harvest, sealing them over to block out any mold or rot. This simple, completely passive process was the key. It was preservation with zero energy and almost zero work. Once cured, those squash could sit in a cool, dark pantry for 4, 5, even 6 months, ready for a winter meal. They were the perfect low-effort, high-reward food. But they weren't the only plants in the garden that thrived on being left alone. There were also the tough, thorny bushes that modern gardeners have all but forgotten, the ones that gave a harvest for decades. Long before we fussed over high-maintenance blueberries, with their demands for acidic soil and delicate netting, old gardens had tougher, thornier, and frankly, more practical bushes. They were the forgotten workhorses of the fruit patch, gooseberries and currants. The forgotten berry bushes. These weren't delicate plants. They were rugged, hardy, and almost indestructible. They were the true plant-it-and-forget-it fruits, thriving in the spots where fussier plants would fail. They didn't care about perfect soil. They were unbothered by most pests, and they shrugged off the diseases that plague modern hybrids. Grandma would stick a bush in some half-forgotten corner by a fence line, and it would just produce. Year after year, those thorny, unassuming branches would be weighed down with buckets of tart, jewel-like berries, green, red, or deep, inky purple. They weren't always sweet enough for fresh eating, but that wasn't the point. They were for the kitchen. They had the natural pectin and the acidic punch to make the most incredible jams, jellies, and pies. They were the practical, high-yield fruit for the gardener who had real work to do. Today, we've lost our taste for the tart and our patience for the thorny, walking right past the plants that could give us so much for so little. These bushes were a testament to getting a massive harvest from a tiny, neglected corner. But perhaps the most ingenious, less work strategy of all, the one that truly guaranteed abundance, didn't involve a plant. It was a philosophy, and it usually started with a zucchini. The ultimate less work secret wasn't a plant. It wasn't a tool or a clever trick with a clay pot. It was a philosophy, and it usually started with a zucchini. The Too Much Zucchini Network. In August, everyone had too much zucchini. You couldn't give it away. But this problem was actually the key to the entire system. Grandma's generation understood that true, large-scale abundance didn't come from one person trying to do everything. That was just a recipe for burnout. The real efficiency was in specialization. Grandma, for instance, had the sunniest spot, so she focused on growing too many tomatoes. Her neighbor down the street, Mrs. Gable, had the perfect soil for root crops and grew too many carrots. The work of trading on the front porch a basket of sun, warm tomatoes for a bunch of fresh dug carrots was hardly work at all. It was a social call. It was an excuse to lean on a fence post in the evening sun, to trade a recipe, to find out who was sick and who just had a new grandchild. The zucchini, the tomatoes, that was just the ticket to entry. The real harvest was the community. It was an informal front porch economy. It was far less labor to master one crop and share it than it was to struggle with 20. We look back and call it self-sufficiency, but we're missing the point. It was community sufficiency. That generosity was the final, most brilliant technique. It was the one piece of old-world wisdom that guaranteed everyone on the block had more than enough. And it's probably the one we've forgotten the most.